This is the reading for Advanced Studio Classroom, April 2006. Page 8, The Art of Coming Home. The challenge of living abroad and coming home. Many executives have experienced the combination of anticipation and anxiety as they prepare for a posting abroad. What many executives fail to anticipate is the culture shock they experience on returning home. Cross-cultural specialist Craig Storty addresses these experiences in a clearly written book called The Art of Coming Home. Home as a foreign country. Anyone who has lived abroad for any amount of time, even as short as 1 year, will understand the adjustment that coming home requires. While you may recognize some of the features of home, you will find others surprising, offensive, and even shocking, explains Storty in The Art of Coming Home. The reason? When people find themselves in a foreign country, they gradually establish a few routines to make their lives more predictable and controllable. As this process occurs, Storty writes, you begin to get used to more and more, but not all, of the unusual behaviors and living conditions you find around you. In the case of the behaviors, you even start to adopt a few. Successful re-entry. What happens then when you come home, Storty continues? Wherever you turn, you are confronted by behaviors and circumstances that now seem as different to you as many of those you encountered when you first arrived abroad. One of the keys to successful re-entry, explains Storty, is to adjust your attitudes and expectations. In other words, be ready to be surprised. Storty also shows what friends and family can do for the returning expatriate. The book also covers other facets of coming home. For example, what organizations can do for returning employees, and how parents can help younger children and teenagers adapt to the return home. Why Soundview likes this book. The Art of Coming Home is typical of the titles published by Intercultural Press, a small Maine publisher that specializes in authoritative how-to guides on cross-cultural relations. Any person facing the prospect of coming home from abroad would do well to start with this title. Then request the Intercultural Press catalog for more detailed guides on specific countries. Vocabulary focus. Posting. Offensive. Re-entry. Authoritative. Page 10. The Perfect Child. Children's perfectionism can lead to misery and even mediocrity. We think we know who the perfectionists are in our children's classrooms. They're the overachievers. They're the ones whose schoolwork is always done on time and who always earn A's. They're the ones who excel at everything they do. And they do everything. Ballet, piano, soccer, French lessons, choir, drama, and church youth group. But these kids can be viciously self-critical when they fall short of their impossibly high standards, which far exceed those of parents or teachers. Their joyless, self-imposed quest to prove and improve themselves can make their lives miserable. Maybe your child is a perfectionist. The not-so-perfect child. Then there are those other kids, the chronic underachievers, the ones whose schoolwork is rarely done on time, and who rarely earn more than a B. Their expectations of themselves are set low, and they meet these. Their approach to life seems lackadaisical, with little effort or enthusiasm in sight. Maybe your child is one of these kids. If so, your child may also be a perfectionist. The anxiety of perfectionism. Perfectionists try to protect themselves from embarrassment, criticism, anger, and the withdrawal of love or approval, says Virginia Smith Harvey of the National Association of School Psychologists. This results in fear of making errors or wrong decisions, emotional guardedness, inclination to worry, and cautiousness. Harvey says this trait is common in children who have been identified as gifted and seems to result from a desire to be considered best in all situations. The paradox of perfectionism. Perfectionists are not always the stereotypical, hard-driving overachievers. Frequently, perfectionists feel such anxiety over the possibility of failing that, according to Harvey, they refuse to try activities rather than risk failing, and consequently fall into a pattern of underachieving. Procrastination is another characteristic of a perfectionist child. Clinical psychologist and author Lawrence Kuttner says, "Therein lies the paradox of perfectionism. There's a perverse feeling of safety that comes from not studying for an imminent exam or not writing a book report until the evening before it's due. The child perfectionist feels that such work cannot be considered a true measure of his abilities. The incompleteness of his efforts allows him the fantasy that he could have done it perfectly if he'd only had the time. By not starting in a timely fashion, he puts off facing his fear of being less than perfect." Curbing perfectionism. Harvey and Kuttner advise parents and teachers to try these tactics. Model graceful acceptance of your own shortcomings. Laugh at your own mistakes. Be gracious and forgiving of others' failures and shortcomings. Redefine the word mistake. Teach that mistakes are proof of learning instead of failure. Give your child permission to make mistakes and discuss the benefits of making mistakes, learning patience, new skills, and the development of useful experience. Help your child explore the degree to which perfectionism affects all aspects of life, including relationships, work, play, and appearance. Help your children identify comments they make to themselves that are critical, judgmental, and derogatory. Help them develop alternative, more positive internal messages. Directly address your child's fear that if they are not perfect, failure is ensured. Develop the concept that any grade other than an A is not an F. Encourage self-compassion. Vocabulary focus. Mediocrity. Viciously. Self-imposed. Lackadaisical. Guardedness. Paradox. Stereotypical. Perverse. Model. Derogatory. Compassion.
The program first is my wife, Angela. Hi, dear.
Hello, Troy. Happy April Fool's Day, by the way.
Well, that's right. It is April 1st, but we're not going to play
No.
a trick or a joke on our listeners.
We're not going to play any April Fool's joke. I'm glad to be here because, as you know, and I'm sure some of our listeners know, this is the art of coming home, that is going back home, is something that we have experienced with our family.
We call that returning to your home culture. When you live overseas, you are living in your host culture. But when you return home, it's returning to your home culture. And sometimes the transition, the shock that people feel can be quite great. Also with us on the program to share today's lesson is Naomi. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Troy. And I just wanted to say that I've only visited home for a couple of weeks since I've been here in Asia for quite a while. And it was just the little things that struck me when I was there. It was only for a couple of weeks. But, you know, the money looked so strange to me, and the buildings and the roads looked so big, and just those little things that feel natural when you're in the middle of them, suddenly when you're re-encountering them can be very shocking.
My wife and I first came to Asia in 1991, and so it has been our experience in returning home to know or to sense the disorientation that people often feel. And when you talk to people and they look at you in strange ways, and it's as though you don't understand what they do. And I remember returning home one time and noticing that there were black and white was kind of the chic color. Everybody was getting something in black and white, and it had to do with cows. There was this huge surge of popular artifacts or things that people would buy related to cows and anything that was black and white. And I just didn't get it for the longest time until I talked to my sister. And I really felt out of the loop, we say. Well, why don't we begin with today's lesson? Then we will read on page 8 in your advanced magazine into column 2, line 16.
The art of coming home. The challenge of living abroad and coming home. Many executives have experienced the combination of anticipation and anxiety as they prepare for a posting abroad. What many executives fail to anticipate is the culture shock they experience on returning home. Cross-cultural specialist Craig Storty addresses these experiences in a clearly written book called The Art of Coming Home. Home as a foreign country. Anyone who has lived abroad for any amount of time, even as short as 1 year, will understand the adjustment that coming home requires. While you may recognize some of the features of home, you will find others surprising, offensive, and even shocking, explains Storty in The Art of Coming Home. The reason? When people find themselves in a foreign country, they gradually establish a few routines to make their lives more predictable and controllable. As this process occurs, Storty writes, you begin to get used to more and more, but not all, of the unusual behaviors and living conditions you find around you. In the case of the behaviors, you even start to adopt a few.
Advanced Studio Classroom, we are on page 8 in the magazine. This is, Angela, an executive book summary.
Yes, Troy. Today our lesson is taken from the executive book summaries of Soundview Company. So what we have here is actually an unedited book review. That's what we'll be talking about.
Okay, so the art. It is an art when you return to your home culture, leaving your host culture and return to your home culture. There is an art in making an adjustment.
Right, and they're not talking about art like the art you hang on a wall. They're talking about the way that you do something well.
Yes, and it is a combination of anticipation and anxiety as you leave your home culture and go overseas. It says here for a posting abroad. Well, the word posting is not really commonly used, but it does say, usually we would say an assignment.
Right.
But in this sense, the posting does mean a job.
Sure. So executives often receive overseas assignments, and they will go into or move into their new post.
And so a posting, for instance, could be like an army posting. If you're with a different organization and they want to send you to a new country, they might say, this is a new posting for you to go and work there.
All right. It's one of our vocab focus words. You can read it there at the bottom. It says a job often within the same organization that one is working for, which involves going to a different country or town. Well, executives who are asked by their company to move or to live internationally they commonly experience this, and they understand what this means.
Well, they are usually given orientation sessions. Even before they leave, they will be given what they call pre-posting orientation, which prepares them for making adjustments in their new culture. But then what many executives fail to realize is that they also need this kind of help for going back home.
Sure. And so when they do return home, they experience culture shock. And culture shock is something that Angela and I both, in returning to the United States from Asia, have felt many times over. And it's interesting they don't use the words cultural adjustment here, but culture shock, because it is a shock. And this word is a little more intense.
Right. Our definition says a condition of disorientation affecting someone who is suddenly exposed to an unfamiliar culture, a way of life, or a set of attitudes. Now, it's interesting that they do use it for somewhere you're returning to, because I think there are certain things about a culture that we're very aware of, for instance, language or food. But there are little habits and attitudes that you don't remember are different sometimes.
That's true.
So you'll suddenly encounter them, and it will shock you.
And cultures change over time, don't they, Naomi?
Absolutely.
So even when you are returning, in our case, to the United States, you experience culture shock, and you experience it too in Asia when you move here for the first time.
Quite often, this kind of culture shock, the kind going back home, is called reverse culture shock.
Okay, so you experience that then in both ways, when entering your host culture and returning to your home culture. Well, cross-cultural specialist Craig Storty addresses these experiences then in his book called The Art of Coming Home, which is what today's lesson is about. It's an executive book summary that we've written here. It's unedited. It's complete. And then we see then in column 2 on page 8 in your advanced magazine, it says, home as a foreign country. Rather strange, isn't it?
Well, it's the point that Naomi just mentioned, that once you move into a foreign country, there are adjustments that you make. They become habits in your daily life, and after a while, it begins to feel like home.
Absolutely, and I have actually a funny example of that. The other day, I was spending some time with 2 Americans, one of whom had been living in Taipei for quite some time, and the other of whom was just visiting. And the one who had been living here said, "Oh, let me pay for that." And the visitor immediately said, "Oh, thank you very much." And that would never happen where we're living. I mean, people fight over bills and they say, "Oh, no, let me, no, let me." And you always expect a struggle. And so it was funny to see an American taking on that behavior.
That is interesting. You know, when you're living in your host culture, too, you do make those cross-cultural adjustments.
I think it's important to do.
It is. Yeah. So that you become multicultural, or we say bicultural, in that when you are living in Asia, you act as an Asian. Now, I know that I can never be Asian, of course, because I'm from the West. On the other hand, I can at least, form my behavior and my expectations in ways that conform to the culture of Asia. And on the other hand, when I return to the United States, I also need to transition myself back into a Westerner.
Right. Well, we're looking here as home as a foreign country, and the fact is that any of us who have lived abroad for at least a year, we understand that going back to our home culture requires adjustment.
Interesting, too. People that I've talked with who have gone back to their home culture, once, upon returning home and speaking with their friends, talking with their family, they'll often feel that, hey, nobody's asking me about my experience. It's as though I never left. And you feel rather strange because you expect them to ask you about your experience. And really, you need to share your experience with others. It's a part of your debriefing process. But that often doesn't happen. They just expect that you are the same person that you were when you left. And in fact, you're not.
When you go back to your home culture, you view it differently because now you have a way to compare it. And as the writer says here, there are some features of your home culture that you might find surprising, even offensive and shocking.
Right, and offensive means causing upset or hurt feelings or feelings of annoyance, which is really interesting because when you're in the middle of living in a culture, nothing really surprises you about it most of the time. But if you've been away and you come back to it, you have these new eyes to see it with.
Yes, the things that the people in that culture consider important. One of the things I notice is the wastefulness. And it's like, why do they buy all of these little bitty knickknacks and unnecessary items, spend money for these little junk pieces? And that was something I really hadn't thought about before.
Well, interesting. Living here in Asia, traffic rules are a bit different in some places. And so when I went back to the States, I recall 1 year for the summer, I took a little more liberty at the stoplights and probably should not have done so because I ended up getting in the way of traffic that was actually part of a funeral train. And I wasn't aware of that. And having done that, I had these Americans honking at me and pointing their finger at me, and I realized that I had committed a faux pas, a social sin. So suddenly I thought, I'm back in America. I need to be more conscientious about the way I drive. It isn't that I don't in Asia, I am conscientious about the way I drive my car. On the other hand, there are sometimes a little more freedom of expression in the way that you drive, if I might say it that way.
I guess that's a good way to say it.
Okay, so you might find some of the activities, the cultural expressions, and the experiences of people from your home culture rather different and surprising after having lived abroad, because you do change. The reason? What is the reason presented here, Naomi?
Well, when people find themselves in a foreign country, they do establish a few routines to make their lives more predictable and controllable. So that can be all kinds of things that are just a little bit more like home, or even something new that just makes you feel comfortable where you are. But then as that process occurs, the writer says, you begin to get used to more and more of the unusual behaviors and living conditions you find around you, and your culture becomes less and less what you're familiar with.
Isn't that interesting?
And for example, in my experience living in the States, I might go to the grocery store once a week and buy enough food for the whole week. Whereas here in Asia, I'm more likely to stop by the market each day to buy just 1 day or 2 days food. So that's one of those adjustments that makes my life more predictable that I make.
Sure, and I've noticed something that really struck me was financially, it makes sense to eat out more frequently here than it does in North America. And so I know it'll be a challenge for me, anytime I'm back to remind myself that it doesn't really make sense to eat out for every meal, whereas here sometimes it can.
One of the ways to establish a routine, of course, and to make things more predictable and controllable has more to do, I think, not necessarily behavior, but it has more to do with the things that you surround your life with, such as the people that you interact with, even such physical things as pictures on the wall. They say this is a good thing to help you in making that cross-culture adjustment, is to put pictures on the wall that remind you of home. And there's another thing I think that we practiced that really helped us, and that is to retain or maintain your family traditions. The very same things you did in the United States, in our case, are the very same things we continue to do here in Asia, to keep those family traditions. So that helps to maintain some sense of control or predictability in your life.
Sure, we have an article later this month about Starbucks being in Asia, and for me that's been helpful as I got used to life here to say, once every other week or so, I can go for a coffee at Starbucks like I always did in Canada, and that's okay.
The author here on lines 14 and 15 also talks about the living conditions that we establish in our host country. And one of those that I recall is here our floors are not with carpet. They're usually tile or stone. Right. And so we sweep the floor. Much more frequently than we would vacuum our carpet back in the States. So that relates to our living condition.
Okay, so, again, this helps to make your life more predictable and controllable by establishing routines. Also, you begin to get more and more of the unused to or accustomed to the unusual behaviors and living conditions you find around you. And it says in the case of the behaviors, you even start to adopt a few. Now, I can share with you 2 behaviors that I find here in Asia that I have adopted. First is that when I'm talking to persons who are sitting rather close to me, I put my hand over my mouth. That's something I didn't do in the States, but something here that older people tend to do, and even people who may be a little more shy or embarrassed. It's a kind thing. So I've done that. When I am talking close to somebody, I'll put my hand just under my nose so that you can't see my mouth while I'm talking. The second thing I do is that when I motion for my daughters to come over or to come to me, I'll turn my palm down, rather than up, as I would do in the United States if I'm motioning for someone to come in my direction. So those are at least 2 of the cultural practices that I've adopted since I've been in Asia, and there are more.
Chopsticks. I never used to eat with chopsticks on a regular basis, but here I absolutely do. And it's funny, my style, I feel like my personal style has been affected somewhat too. I got a haircut, and I feel just more like I'm Asian now because it's the haircut I see on so many people here.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, and those are examples of how our living in a different culture affect us. I had thought of the one of motioning for our daughters. I also have adopted that. And it just seems so natural now that when I go back to the U.S., I still automatically, with my palm down, will motion for my daughters to come.
And also, while I continue to shake hands, and that's a warm part of me. That when I reach out to shake someone's hand, I'm not doing it aggressively, I'm doing it in a very warm way. And for me, it's a means of friendship. It's a signal of friendship with the other person. However, it isn't always received the same way by everyone, so I also bow too. I don't bow deeply, but I will at least give a slight, what we would call genuflection, in some way acknowledging the other person and giving them some honor and respect.
I've noticed I've started to pick that up as well. Just a little bit of a bow, a little bit of a head nod when I meet people. It's just more polite here. And I can't imagine what I'll look like when I'm home and meeting new people and they say, "Why are you bowing?"
One of the things, though, I haven't picked up that I wish I had is carrying my name cards. I forget to carry my name cards all the time.
Well, I keep mine in my wallet so that if I need them at any time, I can pull them out. And then in all of my suit jackets at home, I have name cards in all of my jackets so that they're always there when I'm wearing a jacket, just in case I forget. Well, now let's read the second half of today's lesson. On page 8 in your advanced magazine, this section begins with Successful Reentry.
Successful reentry. What happens then when you come home? Storti continues. Wherever you turn, you are confronted by behaviors and circumstances that now seem as different to you as many of those you encountered when you first arrived abroad. One of the keys to successful reentry, explains Storti, is to adjust your attitudes and expectations. In other words, be ready to be surprised. Storti also shows what friends and family can do for the returning expatriate. The book also covers other facets of coming home. For example, what organizations can do for returning employees, and how parents can help younger children and teenagers adapt to the return home. Why Soundview likes this book. The Art of Coming Home is typical of the titles published by Intercultural Press, a small Maine publisher that specializes in authoritative how-to guides on cross-cultural relations. Any person facing the prospect of coming home from abroad would do well to start with this title. Then request the Intercultural Press catalog for more detailed guides on specific countries.
Studio Classroom, Advanced Program, page 8, Successful Reentry. So, what happens then when you come home? And the writer of the book, The Art of Coming Home, Craig Storti, goes on to say what, Angela?
Well, first of all, that word reentry is one of our vocabulary focus words, and it means simply the act of returning to one's native country. So that's what we're talking about now, how to do this successfully. What does Craig say? Well, what happens when you come home? Well, you're faced with the prospect of making some adjustments.
Okay, so what does he say, Naomi?
He says that wherever you turn, you're confronted by behaviors and circumstances that, while you were used to them when you lived there, now seem very strange and different to you.
Okay, he uses the word encounter, confront. Interesting verbs that are used here. You are confronted by behaviors and circumstances, and you encounter. It says many of those when you first arrived abroad. So now it's in reverse. As you said, reverse culture shock is what you experience. It's like, wait, these are my people. This is my home country. This is my home culture. But boy, it certainly seems so much different than what I remember it.
Well, as we defined culture shock, it is a condition of disorientation. And I think that word, disorientation, describes it perfectly. The way I feel the first time I walk into a supermarket in the States and I'm wanting to buy a soft drink or cereal or just anything, you can walk in there and like 50, 60, 70 choices. It just becomes mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, what's been frustrating for me is that some of the old brands I, had been accustomed to buying, having lived in Asia since 1991. That's a good number of years. And upon returning home, I'm looking for those old brands. Those old brands are gone. They've been replaced by new improved brands.
Right.
So I can't find them. And so it's a bit frustrating. I have to spend time reading the labels on all these new brands.
It can be pretty shocking, which is why he goes on to say that one of the keys to re-entering a country successfully is to adjust your expectations. He says, be prepared to be surprised. Like, there are going to be things that are going to catch you off guard. And if you know that going in, it's easier to deal with it when it comes up.
It is. And so some of the kindness, the kind ways in which we find ourselves treated here in Asia isn't always the same way you'll be treated back home. Now, you might expect that, even anticipate that, but when it actually happens, you have to adjust your attitude because you might feel hurt. You might feel put off or put out. So you need to adjust your attitudes.
For most of the people we encounter in our home culture, they've never lived abroad, so they don't understand what it's like to be an expatriate. That's one of the words he uses here. An expatriate is someone who moves away from their native country and adopts a new resident abroad. For short, we call these people expats.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, they've also changed that word. They're also calling us internationals.
There you go. But that sentence, it says that he shows what friends and family can do for this returning person. And that reminds me of coming back to one's family. Returning to your country of origin is much like going home for the holidays after you've grown up and seen some other things. You sort of come home and expect everything to be the same as it always was when you were young. But of course, you've experienced new things that your family hasn't. And so returning to your home country can feel the same way. Or you have to remember that you've experienced other things, and not everyone's going to always understand that.
No.
But hopefully they can be sympathetic, and you can just try to explain it to them as you go along.
When we first came to Asia, and then upon returning home, we were so desiring and wanting to get home, feeling we missed home, wanted to see parents, and just, again, be close to those things that we were familiar with. On the other hand, when we returned home, we discovered that those things had not changed at all in many ways. And so it was okay for us at that point then to return to Asia. But now your kids, it can be another matter. I hear that kids actually transition cross-culturally more easily than adults do.
That can be true, but I think the opposite can also be true. One of the things I did to help our daughters in the transition was to make a photo album for each of them. So while we were still here in Asia, I pulled out some representative photos of our 4 years prior to our leaving, put them in a photo album, and then when we got to the States, they had these books to look at, and it helped them, I think, to connect the U.S. experience with their Asia experience.
Clearly, you're a very considerate mother. It sounds like you might have read a book like this.
I did.
So it's important that if you are, in fact, facing the prospect of returning to your home culture, or perhaps you're facing the prospect of going abroad, why don't you look into getting this book written by Mr. Storti called The Art of Coming Home. Is it still being printed by Intercultural Press, Angela?
Yes, Intercultural Press prints many books related to this subject and others about internationals living abroad. This is an authoritative how-to guidebook. Authoritative just means it's containing the complete and accurate information. But this publisher has now been bought out by another group, so you can use the website that we've listed here for the author.
All right. You can see the website address on page 9 in your advanced magazine. Thank you for being with us today. I hope that you've learned something about yourself and us, too. Until next time, this is Troy,
Angela,
And Naomi.
saying goodbye.
goodbye. Ways
And they're
average
wonderful.
in others, and they are very wonderful children, but they're not perfect.
No, I don't think anybody has a perfect child, but we're also very glad to have a very special guest who used to be on Studio Classroom for many years, and then she moved to Los Angeles with her family. And introduce our special guest today.
All right, it's my privilege to introduce Susan Chung and her 2 children, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Let's give Susan and her family a big welcome. Susan, it's so good to have you back in Studio Classroom.
Yes, it's good to be back. When we live in Los Angeles, the whole America can hear our program too. But now I'm very glad I'm in the studio with you guys.
Well, and actually, Susan is working for Studio Classroom, and you have a lot of English classes there in Arcadia, don't you?
Right. Not only in Arcadia, the whole West Coast, now we develop many classes, and even advanced class now is growing.
Right. So we have a lot of people listening in, and you're going to be glad to hear Susan because she's usually over there in California, but here she is with us in our Studio Classroom today. I'm glad you stopped by to see us, and your children grew up on Studio Classroom. Let's introduce them.
Hello, I'm Daniel, and I'm currently a freshman at UC Berkeley, and it's an honor to be on this show. Thanks.
And you grew up right here at Studio Classroom, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And what about your little sister?
Oh, my name is Esther Chang, and I go to Arcadia High School in Arcadia, California. It's great to be on the show.
When did you start teaching English?
When I was about 3 or 4, I started
3 or 4 years old because she was in a kindergarten. And since her mother was Susan and taught her Studio Classroom English, she would teach the other kids. And she said, I'm a Studio Classroom teacher when she was about 3. Remember that?
Right.
Susan?
It's funny, but, it's really good that she came to our nursery. We have our ORTV nursery, and she come back there and sits there, and all the kids would sit there, listen to her, and they talk, and she taught English to them.
Yes, that can happen when you're right out here in Taiwan, can it?
Yes, it does happen. It happened to my older daughter, too. She was the only foreigner in a school of 100 Chinese children. And so the teacher started calling her Little Teacher.
That's right.
I think she still has that idea with her, doesn't she?
Yes, she does.
But you're now 14 years old. How do you like going to school in Los Angeles area?
I love my school.
Good.
It's great.
Well, we're going to have you give us some ideas from people in high school and university as we talk about this idea of perfectionism. Now, Angela, we have talked about this subject for adults before, haven't we? Perfectionism.
Yes, we have. And what we see exhibited in the behavior of adults is probably something that began in their childhood.
That's
so
true.
Today the article especially addresses the perfect child.
Right. And, we've talked about the fact that everybody would like to be perfect, but we can't be. So does that mean we shouldn't try? And in our article before, when we talked about adults, we said that you cannot be perfect, but you can be excellent. So try to be excellent, but don't try to be perfect. There's a big difference in being excellent than there is in being perfect. Isn't that right?
Yes, I like this idea. So I think this article will help us to tell from the perfectionism to be excellent.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you want your child to excel. You want them to do their best, but don't expect them to be perfect, and don't be upset with them when they aren't perfect. Just say, do your best, whatever that is.
Yeah, especially Asian parents, even I live here or move to America, I still see the Asian parents put more pressure want their kids to achieve their unfulfilled dream. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be aware of that.
So this is a very important article for mothers and fathers, as well as anybody that has relatives that has something to do with children. School teachers?
Yes, and I have to say, even Western parents, Susan, you addressed Asian parents, but Western parents, too, will put pressure on their children to achieve high achievements. Now, it might not always be the academic achievements that they're pressuring. It could be athletic achievements.
Or music.
It's right.
Anything.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But children's perfectionism can lead to misery and even mediocrity. Mediocrity is a very interesting word here. What does it actually mean?
Well, we've used the word mediocre, which means average, ordinary.
普通. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So mediocrity is the noun of that word, and it just means the condition of being ordinary, average, not outstanding.
And ordinarily, that's not bad to be average, but on the other hand, when you can do better and you don't, then you say, well, you don't want to just be like that. So in this sense, it means that you could do better, but you don't because there's too much expected of you.
Well, in my perspective, I believe that there is a way in which every person can be above average. Mm-hmm. You see, it may not be in the academic realm. It could be in their sense of creativity. Or it could be socially.
That's true.
Or just in the sense of their being able to understand themselves. And I think we can talk about this more as we go through the article.
Well, I think we could talk about this article for a whole month because there's so much on it. But it's on page 10 now. And we're going to talk about what it means if you try to think that a child can be perfect or if they think so. So let's begin our reading today and read the first couple of paragraphs.
We think we know who the perfectionists are in our children's classrooms. They're the overachievers. They're the ones whose schoolwork is always done on time and who always earn A's. They're the ones who excel at everything they do. And they do everything. Ballet, piano, soccer, French lessons, choir, drama, and church youth group. But these kids can be viciously self-critical when they fall short of their impossibly high standards, which far exceed those of parents or teachers. Their joyless, self-imposed quest to prove and improve themselves can make their lives miserable. Maybe your child is a perfectionist.
If your child is a perfectionist, it will be much harder for them when they get older. So the time to find out is now. So let's think about this problem. We know that there are many in classrooms. Daniel, are there any in your classroom there where you go to school in Stanford? Do you have any perfectionists in your classrooms?
In my opinion, in a competitive environment such as Berkeley, everyone is a perfectionist to some degree, and that's what motivates them to study and excel in their studies. Because in college, there's so many distractions out there, and you got to be some kind of a perfectionist to align yourself with the curriculum and with the stuff that the university throws at you in order to actually stay in school.
Well, but what if you get a pretty good grade and you don't get the top grade? Like there's B's, not everybody has to get A's and so forth. Do you feel badly if you don't get the A? Can you be satisfied with a B sometimes or not? Or do you feel that you failed if you get a B?
In high school, I would say that getting a B is a really big deal to a lot of people. But in college, since college entirely different environment and it's much more rigorous than high school, a B is actually hard to get in itself.
So it's not too bad.
The professors expect you to get C's, and only the brilliant people get A's and B's. So B really isn't that big of a deal in college.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you feel that way about it, but if you're a perfectionist, you might not be able to sleep because you got that.
Well, Doris, I must confess that I am a recovering perfectionist.
Well, there's several of them on our staff, so I know that.
I think that for the work we do, we sort of have to be perfectionists to keep the errors out of our magazine.
Still make mistakes sometimes.
But I say I'm a recovering perfectionist because when I was Daniel's age and in university, I would not settle for anything less than an A, and I deliberately avoided taking classes that I knew I could not get an A in, and I'm sorry for that now. Our article addresses that.
Mm-hmm. Ah. Well, did your folks expect you to get that grade or not?
No. I put that pressure on myself.
Because sometimes parents expect you to do that, right?
Right.
But you don't expect your son and daughter to get all A's, do you, Susan?
No, I don't really expect them to do that. But
Just do
I
your
want
best.
them to be doing their best and at least above average on the subject.
Right. Well, you want them to be excellent, but they don't have to be perfect.
Right.
And if you know they study hard, though, and they did their best, then you don't feel badly about it.
Yeah, and most of all, I like my kids to be able to become self-motivated, a learner.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yes.
another thing is, there's not only schoolwork. You need to learn how to play with other people, to relax, to do other things. And if you only just can study, then you're not a well-rounded person. You don't know how to use your knowledge. And so you need all of those things, sometimes even working part-time. I learned a lot of things that I might not have learned by just studying at school.
Right.
Because you learn how to interact with other people. You have to make decisions about how you should be. So you learn more than just the school books.
Well, I found this is true for me because I look back now at my advanced age, and I can see that it took me a long time to mature socially. And emotionally, I lagged behind my peers because I did just give myself to the books.
Now, did you have a lot of friends that way, and did you have fun and have a good time when you were doing that or not? I mean, a whole lot of friends or not?
Oh, you mean friends who were like that?
Well, I mean, could you relax and have fun and everything, or were you too busy studying?
It was always hard for me to relax and just have fun.
See, I used to be relaxed and have fun. I was a different type. Because I think, of course, I had a lot of brothers and sisters, too. And I knew I couldn't get all A's, and I did my best. But I still felt that we still had to have a good time. And so you have a lot of friends, and I think you need a well-rounded life, too.
Well, I think so.
Yes, I can remember many beautiful spring afternoons when I sat inside trying to memorize English grammar or studying history, and other people are out playing softball, and having fun in the beautiful, bright sunshine.
So I think sometimes it depends on the way you've been brought up, too, doesn't it? But, some of these kids excel at everything, and their ballet lessons, their dancing, their piano lessons, their sports, whatever it is, and French or Chinese or what other lessons, whatever they do, in church groups, wherever they go, they have to excel. But they can be very hard on themselves. And it says viciously self-critical. And what does viciously mean?
就是对自己非常的严厉的感觉，有一点痛苦的哈。
Right. Anybody that's vicious. Sometimes we talk about a vicious animal. A vicious dog might bite you. 太凶恶, it's very bad. So they could be very hard on themselves, and then they get psychological problems, and then sometimes they start taking medicine for it, and they get depressed, and the whole thing just isn't good.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because this morning I picked up one of my daughter's magazines. She's in high school, and she gets these high school girl magazines. The cover article was about a singing group, Zoe Girls, I think. It's popular in the States. And the article was about the song Scream that one of these girls had written, and the whole thing had to do with her overcoming depression and perfectionism, and it was the self-mutilization. Talk about vicious.
Yeah.
I mean, she was actually cutting herself. And she said, the pain, the emotional pain that she felt was then transferred into the physical pain that she would cause herself. And that was her way of coping with. I mean, that is really vicious.
So it's dangerous. Well, there are some children who, even though they don't maybe get the best of the overachievers, they become underachievers too. And so they try to be the not-so-perfect child. Let's read about that.
The not-so-perfect child. Then there are those other kids, the chronic underachievers, the ones whose schoolwork is rarely done on time, and who rarely earn more than a B. Their expectations of themselves are set low, and they meet these. Their approach to life seems lackadaisical, with little effort or enthusiasm in sight. Maybe your child is one of these kids. If so, your child may also be a perfectionist.
So the first group we called overachievers, and the second group we're going to call underachievers, and it says chronic, which means it's a condition that just goes on and on. It's not just a one-time thing. Now, what are they like, Angela, these underachievers?
They are the ones who rarely get their schoolwork done on time, and they rarely earn higher than the B grade, which is just above average.
Right.
But that's what they expect of themselves.
Okay, they have low expectations. And then it seems that their approach to life is, we could say here, mama hoo-hoo, lackadaisical. They don't care.
Right.
不管, Lackadaisical is a very interesting word. We don't use it a lot. You don't have to memorize it. But it just means mama hoo-hoo, lackadaisical. Okay, they don't have, much enthusiasm and so forth. And so they also could be a perfectionist in some way. Now, how could that be a perfectionist if you're an underachiever? What do you think?
Well, Doris, this is interesting because, I've confessed that I am a recovering perfectionist, and I've actually had to deliberately try to overcome this. You can see I brought some books in today.
Yes.
These are books that I have studied that have helped me to change this behavior. One of them is called Telling Yourself the Truth, and then the one I have open here is Freedom from the Performance Trap.
Now, maybe you could put that on the website so that our other
Yes.
people you could put it on our Studio Classroom Advanced website. How about that? The
Okay,
names.
I will. The link to where to find it. But it's interesting that perfectionism exhibits itself in three primary ways. One is the overachievers that we've just talked about. Another is these people who have a need to belong. They want to feel important to someone. But the third way is just as we've talked about here. It's sort of, I give up. Well, since I can't be perfect anyway, why try?
So then they become kind of lackadaisical. They say, well, I can't do it anyway. And so they don't even go up to the ability that they do have. That's too bad. Some people are very smart, but they just don't do it. You say, well, they could do it if they tried, but they won't try. And those are underachievers. They can do more.
Right.
Their IQ is high and everything. It's not that they're stupid or anything. They just don't try hard enough. And you've seen some of those. Sometimes they get out of that later. Have you ever seen anybody like that in school, Esther, who can do better, but they just don't care? Have you ever met anybody like that?
Yes, a lot of the students in Arcadia High, they're really, really smart, but some of them just don't go up to their potential.
Why is that, do you think?
Maybe because they have many distractions, or they just feel that they're not good enough since it's a very competitive school.
Right. Okay. So sometimes, competitiveness is good, but also it can also be a danger for some people. So it's very difficult for a parent or a teacher to monitor that. Let's find out more about this anxiety of perfectionism today.
The anxiety of perfectionism. Perfectionists try to protect themselves from embarrassment, criticism, anger, and the withdrawal of love or approval, says Virginia Smith Harvey of the National Association of School Psychologists. This results in fear of making errors or wrong decisions, emotional guardedness, inclination to worry, and cautiousness. Harvey says this trait is common in children who have been identified as gifted and seems to result from a desire to be considered best in all situations.
It's probably a natural thing for all of us to want to be the best in a way. I mean, we always look at people who are heroes and they're so good at this and that. We kind of want to be like that. Like I know, Daniel, you play the violin, and sometimes don't you wish you could just be as good as some of those violinists you hear on the CDs and so forth? Do you ever feel like that or not?
Well, yes, I do, because violin is a very fulfilling instrument to play, but some people are just naturally more talented than you are, and you could see these people outside and you wish you could play like them.
Right.
And you feel this thirst to be like them, so you keep practicing, but then you invest so much time in it, but then you realize that sometimes they're still better than you, so it turns into this chronic cycle where you just keep going and going and going at this, and sometimes it's not that fulfilling.
Well, now, after, you finally realize, I think when you get into college, it's even after high school, you realize that you are not going to be quite as good as everybody else in something. Like, I realized my math wasn't going to be as good as some people's. And sometimes I was better in something and not as good in something. But first I tried to be just as good in everything. But then you come to the place where you have to accept yourself. Now, did you ever do that, Daniel, once you got into university? Did you feel that you could say, well, I guess I know I'm not going to be that good in that? Can you accept that now or not?
Yes, I can. There are some things in life, I guess, that you just have to accept, it's sort of like a rite of passage you have to go through, that sometimes when you're young, you're not mature enough to think about these subjects, and as you get older, you talk to older brothers and people, and you just realize that this is not what the world is about. It's about actual living and not about being perfect and like yourself.
Good. Now, how old are you now?
I'm currently 19 years old.
19 years old. That's pretty good for a 19-year-old to know that, isn't it?
That's right.
Because some people haven't learned that when they're 30 years old. See? So we have to learn that. And, of course, that doesn't mean you don't try. And you still try to be the best. I'll never be the best trumpet player, but I like to play. And sometimes but I know that I'm not as good as a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I won't play just because of that. You have to enjoy it and play it anyway, see?
It is.
And you have to accept that, don't you? And I think that's very good for us all to learn that. But sometimes you try to protect yourself from embarrassment. You think people will laugh at you, or we don't like to be criticized because we didn't do well. And other people withdraw and they say, I'm not going to try it. I'm not going to play. I'm not going to go bowling because I won't get as high score as Angela, so I just won't go. Well, you have to just say, well, I'll have a good game anyway. Even if Angela beats me, I'm still going to play, and I'll still try. So you need to get mature about that, don't you?
Yes, and there is sometimes the case where you feel that if you do not perform perfectly, then this person who is putting the expectation on you will withdraw their love, their attention, or perhaps they will be angry with you.
And
I
some
think
parents
that
are.
happens.
I've
Yes.
seen that happen. They get very angry because their children didn't get that. And if you don't get good grades, no wonder they feel so bad.
Yes.
It's difficult. It's not easy being a parent, is it?
It's not easy, Doris, because as Susan knows, each of your children have different personalities. They have different potential, different abilities. And so as a parent, you have to discern what their level of achievement can be so that they don't fall under it, or you're not pushing them too hard to overachieve.
Right. Sometimes parents forget their childhood or their teenage time. You know, you are not perfect on everything. So I always recall, when I expect too much on my kids, I would think, oh, I'm not good on math either.
Well, but there are some parents who say, well, I wasn't good enough, but I'm going to make them good enough. So they expect the kids to achieve more than they did. I've seen that sometimes, haven't you?
Right.
Yeah. Well, it says here, on this page 11 here, that the fear of making errors or wrong decision has kind of what we call an emotional guardedness. And we talk about putting up your guard. How do you say that in Chinese, to put up your guard?
就是有一个保护哈，有一个范围。
Right. And so people get kind of emotionally guarded, and you're not going to be leaving yourself open to that. So you either act too proud because you're really afraid and you're going to act like you can do better than you can, or else you won't try at all. There's kind of two reactions there.
That's right. And both of them bring anxiety.
Gets a little bit of worry in the child's life and so forth. So if you're kind of a gifted child, sometimes you're gifted in music, but you're not good in math, then you'll feel bad. So I think it's for your children to give them a very secure, healthy feeling that you love them no matter what they do, but you do want them to excel. And I think that loving them no matter what is a big thing with kids.
Oh, I'm sure. That's one thing we have to ensure our kids that we love them no matter what happened, and also try to help them to see their strengths and identify their shortcoming too.
And I think it's especially important when your child is acting out, when that means bad behavior.
Right.
And you have to assure the child that you still love them. Right. You love them, you accept them as a person, even though you do not accept the behavior that they are showing.
Right. I love you, but not what you do.
Right.
Right.
Okay, well, this is just kind of a psychological type of an article, but it has some very good points in it. And whether you're older or younger, remember that being perfect is not possible, but we can be excellent, right?
That's right.
So we all want to try to do our best. And let's try to help the children understand that so that they are not miserable, like we see the picture of this little girl here on page 10. We have 2 more days to discuss this. We're going to talk about other things that come along the way. It's a very good article for you to read over and discuss with your friends. So thanks for being with us, Susan and Daniel and Esther, and we hope you'll be back to help us teach advanced some days when you get out of school. What about that?
Okay.
That's a good idea.
That's a good idea. And you can still do a lot of other things. Well, your father is a doctor, and he's had to study very hard. Even when he went to the States, he had to study again. And you have to keep studying all your life, don't you?
Right.
But it doesn't hurt to study and learn all you can. But don't worry if you're not perfect or as good as somebody else.
Right. We got to enjoy our study.
Right. We'll do the best we can and be the best you that we can. Be a better you. Okay?
I agree.
Right. We'll be back as we talk about this more tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today, everyone. Goodbye now.
Goodbye.
And went out to lunch, and we came back, and we have changed people in our studio. So let's introduce our new panel. And to my left is
Naomi. And I have to admit that I was a perfect child. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm definitely a perfectionist. So I'm looking forward to learning more about this article.
Oh, Naomi, for a moment there, you had me scared. Well, also with us is Bill. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Angela. You went out to lunch. Did you bring me back any food?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. Did you get any lunch?
No. Well, yeah, of course. I always eat plenty, so I'm okay. But I also was not the perfect child, Angela. And it's an interesting subject, the perfection and how it affects behavior. So I love this article, and there's a lot to review and a lot to talk about, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, there is, Bill. In fact, I told our listeners during our last session that I brought books into the studio because I myself am a recovering perfectionist, which means I still have a lot of those behaviors, but I'm not nearly as bad as I used to be.
Well, I'm wondering, does that influence your behavior as an editor? Because you really need some of those qualities.
Well, there are many ways in which these qualities benefit a person in the sense that you want to be a straight-A student, you want to look your best, you want to keep your health up, you pay your bills on time. I mean, really, there are a lot of good things, and so that tends to be the reward that you get from society. But the downside is it puts a person under an awful lot of pressure. And as we talked about in our last session, there on page 11, at the top left, the anxiety of perfectionism. And that's something that I've had to deal with. And that's why I made the effort to start reading these books, to become a little more laid back and letting some things slide. I mean, I might even be late on repaying my credit card bill now.
Hopefully not too late.
No.
But I identify, and I do think it's true that often editors, proofreaders have to have a degree of perfectionism to their personality, because how else would you be the kind of person who could catch those little mistakes that happen in any process? But to be able to ground it and really remind yourself that no one is perfect. We are going to fail sometimes, and that's okay, can be a real challenge.
I can remember, when I was quite young, one lady I worked with telling me, Angela, the world goes on. The sun comes up tomorrow. It's like a perfectionist tends to think that everything depends on they're doing it exactly right.
Well, from yesterday, there's a couple of different angles to look at this. One, the first section talked about perfectionists, the overachievers. And, for instance, I have a very good friend who is a perfectionist, and he is a business executive. He is a workaholic because he is a perfectionist, and he's very successful financially and in his career, but he's never home. And the other thing is that he cannot delegate responsibilities because nobody can do the job as well as him. So he's never home.
Well, and Bill, he will come to a place where he will not be able to do the job to suit himself.
Right.
And then that's when he will be forced to deal with this behavior. And then we talked about the overachievers. As children, they are the ones that get straight A's. They've joined all the clubs. They're into sporting activities and social groups, youth groups. But then there are the perfectionists who are on the other side of it. They are the underachievers. So how does this happen, Naomi?
Well, I think that probably many people who have ever been students can relate to this. And if you keep pushing and pushing and trying to do your best at everything, it can wear you out. And sometimes you end up doing sort of the reverse and just sort of giving up before you even get started. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today.
And, you know, I admitted that one of the ways this perfectionism affected me is that I would not take classes in school that I thought I could not make an A in. And I'm really sorry for that now because I didn't take piano on as far as I wanted to, because every time I made a mistake, I would go back to the very beginning and start on a piece again, and I'd make another mistake, go back to the beginning and start. And, you know, that's just a part of the pressure of a perfectionist.
I've taught children here in Asia and English in a couple of schools, and I had young children who were 7, 8, 9 years old. And they would be the not-so-perfect child. They actually would literally shut down in class. I would have the class do a writing assignment, write sentences or spelling, and if they couldn't get it perfect, they would actually just sit at their desk and they would not write anything. They would have a blank piece of paper.
I've seen that too, Bill. Okay, so that is two ways that perfectionism affect children. One is they try to be overachievers, and the other is they are underachievers. And the outcome of both, though, is anxiety. Well, today we are picking up with a continuation. We're looking at the paradox of perfectionism. So let's go ahead now and listen to the first reading.
The paradox of perfectionism. Perfectionists are not always the stereotypical, hard-driving overachievers. Frequently, perfectionists feel such anxiety over the possibility of failing that, according to Harvey, they refuse to try activities rather than risk failing, and consequently fall into a pattern of underachieving.
The article is called The Perfect Child. We're looking at this today in our advanced magazine. We've learned that children's perfectionism can lead to misery and mediocrity. But there's a paradox to perfectionism. And what does that word paradox mean?
Great word, Angela. Paradox. It is a situation or statement which seems impossible because it contains two opposite facts or characteristics. It doesn't make sense.
And I think that's true of perfectionism as we are talking about it now. And why would that be?
Well, basically, we see a contrast between this drive to overachieve and this sort of falling into underachieving. And it's like there's a real difficulty for any perfectionist to find a balance there. They usually go to one extreme or the other.
That's right. We have the word here in line 13, stereotypical. And that's the idea that we generally have of a perfectionist. But there are other ways. Give us an example, Bill, of using this word stereotypical in another context.
Well, we might say that, that was stereotypical behavior of the teenagers to throw trash on the ground after they finished eating their hamburgers. And we say stereotypical meaning, everybody does that.
Yes.
Right.
And we use this word, a form of it, as a verb, and we'll say, don't stereotype women. Now,
Correct.
Why might I say that?
Well, because men have certain ideas about women. They think women are going to behave a certain way, and they say, women can't drive well, or they
have no sense of direction.
Right.
Yes. I've heard all those stereotypes.
Our listeners should know that this is often a very negative term.
Yes.
And so if I say, she's a stereotypical blonde, I might mean that she acts kind of dumb. Well, that's a terrible assumption to make about anyone with blonde hair. So try not to stereotype people.
So here in this context, we're saying that perfectionists have been stereotyped as these hard-driving overachievers. But that's not true for all of them.
No. Frequently, the perfectionists feel such anxiety over the possibility of failing that they refuse to try activities.
Yes, now that's exactly what I had admitted of myself. And Naomi, you said that you also suffered from perfectionism.
Absolutely. I mean, not to toot my own horn or anything, but I do have a number of talents, like any person does. There's a number of areas where I'm gifted, but sports, physical activities, I have never taken to it very well. And so for many years now, rather than ever try to do well, I'll just give up altogether. Instead of saying, oh, maybe I'm not very good at football, but I'll join the game anyway and try and have some fun, I'll just sit it out.
Yes.
Because I'm so nervous of doing such a bad job.
And that's the anxiety
Right.
that we talk about. I think many people experience that. Now, this person, Harvey, here, we're using the surname. Actually, we were introduced to her during our last lesson. If you look in the paragraph right above on page 11, you'll see that her full name is Virginia Smith Harvey, and she is a school psychologist. And I mention this because we have two quotes in our sidebars that are taken from some of the research and the writings that she has done. So kids will refuse to try activities rather than risk failing. Now, why might that be?
Well, they're looking for approval from their parents, and nobody wants to fail. They always want to succeed. I thought of another great example, again, teaching here English to young students in Asia. I have many young students whose their English is excellent in the classroom. Maybe they're 10 or 12 years old. I will see them out on the street, walking down the sidewalk with their parents, and they will not say a word. Because they are afraid it won't be perfect. I'll say, oh, hey, how are you, Michael?
Yes.
And they will actually stand there and just stare at me. And their parents are wondering, what am I paying for?
Yeah. Okay. Right. It is a risk to open your mouth and speak. But maybe it's different in my case because I studied Mandarin as an adult, and my teacher said, you're going to make a million mistakes. You might as well get started.
Yeah. But it's true that for some reason, rather than trying something and having someone say, well, you tried hard, you'll do better next time, for many perfectionists, that feels worse than just not trying at all. And then you can just say, oh, if I had put effort into it, I would have done fine. You know.
That's right. And that's deceiving ourselves, I think. One of the books I brought in says telling yourself the truth. And as I read through this psychology article and then reflected back on this book, which I went through and actually applied these principles to myself, this is exactly where the problem is, that we are not telling ourselves the truth. We are actually believing lies like, oh, I'll fail and then everybody will not love me and not accept me.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go on now and read the second portion of today's lesson.
Procrastination is another characteristic of a perfectionist child. Clinical psychologist and author Lawrence Kuttner says, therein lies the paradox of perfectionism. There's a perverse feeling of safety that comes from not studying for an imminent exam or not writing a book report until the evening before it's due. The child perfectionist feels that such work cannot be considered a true measure of his abilities. The incompleteness of his efforts allows him the fantasy that he could have done it perfectly if he'd only had the time. By not starting in a timely fashion, he puts off facing his fear of being less than perfect.
This is Advanced Studio Classroom, listeners. My name is Angela. I'm here with Naomi and Bill. We're talking about a psychology article entitled The Perfect Child. Today, so far, we have been talking about the paradox of perfectionism. Bill, review for us. What does that word paradox mean?
Well, paradox is a situation or statement which seems impossible because it contains two opposites. So it doesn't seem to make sense. It's hard to believe.
You know, another word that came to my mind is irony. The irony of perfectionism is that it often leads people to fail.
And they put things off because they are afraid of that failure. And so there's a fine line where we got to draw here between procrastination and perfectionism, and that's what this next reading talks about.
Okay, so we're picking up with this word procrastination. Procrastination is another characteristic of a perfectionist child. So how would you define procrastination?
I know this word well because my mother has called me a procrastinator for many years now. It's just basically putting off something that you have to do until the last possible moment before it's, due or before it has to be done.
So, Naomi, you are admitting that you have done this.
Oh, yes.
Many
absolutely. In college, I was a big procrastinator. I would just always, the teacher would give us the assignment and say, 20-page essay due in 2 months. Mm-hmm. And then, a month and 28 days later, I would get going on it. I mean, this is often something that you see, especially with perfectionists, and we're going to learn more about why.
Well, I'm curious, though. Were you actually able to write good essays?
Well, that's the problem, of course. Sure, fine essays, acceptable essays, and essays that more than passed, but they also weren't as good as I probably could have done.
And that's the point, I believe. Right. You had the potential to do much better.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Bill.
Often the procrastinating student is the one who stays up the entire night before the test the next day.
We have a great term for that, pulling an all-nighter.
Pulling an all-nighter. I did that in college.
Oh, I sure did too.
Okay, 2 procrastinators in the studio with me.
Drinking coffee all night. Yeah. My eyes would get all crossed.
I hope procrastination doesn't rub off.
Oh, I hope not either. It's not a pleasant thing to be going through, and it seems odd that people would ever make that choice. But as we're learning, it's a perfectionism problem, really.
And it doesn't show up in every instance of perfectionism because I was just the opposite. I would often be over-prepared and prepared too soon. And this is something that has followed me into adulthood. And I've noticed, of course, now I'm able to look at it a little more objectively. And I see where I actually have to do a job 2 times because I've prepared it. And then the whole thing changes, and you have to go and redo it.
That's almost a paradox, Angela. You could be over-prepared.
Right.
That's interesting. You prepare too much, that it's a problem.
Yes, but I'm not nearly that way any longer. So now we're looking at another psychologist quote. Now, this one is a clinical psychologist. First, above, we said that Virginia Smith Harvey is a school psychologist, and now we're talking about a clinical psychologist. Well, that just simply means that he is a psychologist who has a clinic. He observes his patients or talks with them in his clinic. And a school psychologist will often be a clinical psychologist, but their specialty is just aimed at school children. So what does Dr. Lawrence Cutler say?
Well, he says, therein lies the paradox of perfectionism. There's a perverse feeling of safety that comes from not studying for an imminent exam or not writing a book report until the evening before it's due, which I had talked about, pulling the all-nighter.
Well, he uses this word perverse. Do you feel that, well, first of all, let's talk about what does it mean?
Basically, it means it's just something that's strange and not what most people would enjoy. I mean, this feeling of safety doesn't really make sense.
I was going to ask, do you feel that this word is appropriately used here in this Dr. Cutler's quote?
I think so.
Yeah, it's a tricky word in that there's also this fairly negative connotation to it, and unfortunately in some literature it can be even obscene, but in this case the word perverse can be used to describe something. It's appropriate here.
Yes, it is appropriate, and it gives a very strong sense of how odd or strange this behavior is.
Right. Perverse generally means sort of deviating from what's normal, just being different from what most people would expect. And so that can apply to all kinds of behaviors, a lot of them, like we said, fairly negative. But in this case, it's just talking about this problem of procrastination and having this unusual feeling of safety that just doesn't really make sense to most people.
It doesn't make sense to me that a person would feel safe for not studying for an upcoming exam. The word imminent there means that it's coming very quickly. They're not studying or they're not writing the book report that's due. Now, why would they feel safe?
Well, it goes on to explain in the next sentence, the child perfectionist feels that such work cannot be considered a true measure of his abilities. And so I understand this feeling of safety because that was a great example of the kind of behavior I displayed. Often for myself, I would just involve myself in so many different things that I would say, oh, I was so busy with this and this and this, I couldn't do it until the last minute. So, of course, if I got a B, that's because I didn't have enough time.
That's what he says. That's exactly what is written here.
Yeah.
The incompleteness of his efforts allows him the fantasy that he could have done it perfectly if only he had the time.
Right.
Now, this is interesting because the standard for the perfectionist is still absolute perfection.
Right.
And when this person who's intelligent as you are, Naomi, looks at this standard of absolute perfection and you know, I can never be absolutely perfect. So you do build in these behaviors.
This is an interesting psychological concept for our listeners to understand, this fantasy that he could have been perfect. I'll give you an example of something kind of like that. Oftentimes, children might play in a game or a competition, and one might not try real hard. That way there's safety in then saying, well, I lost. I really wasn't trying.
Yes.
And people will do that as a defense mechanism rather than actually give a complete 100% effort and lose. They would rather not try hard and lose. They can always explain it away.
Right.
Right. So whereas someone like yourself, Angela, would have tried really, really hard and then possibly
gotten a B
and been devastated.
Yes.
People like me had done that in the past and then decided it wasn't worth it.
See, I told you you're intelligent.
Well, but then the problem is that in order to justify that, you end up doing other behaviors that, again, aren't healthy for you. While you're realizing that, no, I can never be perfect, you're justifying it in a really negative way.
I think I can understand why our article begins by saying children's perfectionism can lead to misery. Well, but we end here today by saying by not starting in a timely fashion, by procrastinating, then the child can put off facing his fear of being less than perfect. Now, I thought that was interesting. Are we afraid of being less than perfect?
Fear is one of the great motivators in life, Angela. There's two great motivators, fear and love.
I would agree.
And fear, unfortunately, is often more powerful than love.
It doesn't have to be, though.
No,
that's one thing that I have been practicing in my life. That's telling yourself the truth is when you face those fears and you replace them with the truth, which is rooted in love, then you push that away.
Right, and one of the ways that parents can help motivate by love instead of fear is examined in this sidebar on page 11.
Yes, Bill, would you read that entire article for us?
Certainly. Procrastination. Procrastination is putting off tasks for fear of being unable to complete them perfectly or not completing tasks because there is always room for improvement. To help a child counteract severe procrastination, adults can choose from the following activities. Encourage the child to change her goal from perfection to completion of tasks. Help the child break down tasks into manageable parts. Help the child develop realistic schedules. Teach the child to concentrate on tasks for several short time periods. And finally, help the child prioritize and distinguish essential from non-essential details.
Listeners, I want to remind you that we have a website with discussion questions related to this article. And on our website, you will also see some connections, web links, that will take you to the source of this sidebar material. It does come from Dr. Virginia Smith Harvey's research. So let's look. We're talking about how parents, and I would say teachers too, can help children overcome procrastination. The first one, Naomi, just for review?
To encourage the child to change her goal from perfection to just simply completing the task.
That's right. You've achieved the goal if you finish the job. And Bill, what's the second?
They help the child break down tasks into manageable parts. Often we don't do something because the whole looks too big, but we need to make it into small pieces.
And then do the first one, then the second one, and finish it by parts. And then the next one is I like to help my children develop realistic schedules. They often try to pack too much in to the time, or else they say, oh, yeah, Mom, I have time to play a game. I can do that homework later. And then, of course, they never have.
No.
We always think there'll be more time later.
Yes. Okay, Naomi, the next one.
Teach the child to concentrate on tasks for several short time periods. Instead of just sort of plugging away for hours on end, try and break it down.
And that's really quite reasonable because none of us can just stay focused for a long, long, long time. And Bill, the last one?
Finally, help the child prioritize and distinguish essential from non-essential details. What's important?
That's right. And actually, I think it's so great for teachers and parents to really concentrate on these things because I actually have had to teach myself since I got to the workplace how important these little ways of dealing with procrastination are.
Okay, listeners, you can see that this will help you as you work with children, either your own or others, and it can also help you if you have trouble with procrastination. Well, we're not finished. We still have more to talk about. I hope you'll come back next time because Bill, Naomi, and I will be here to give you more tips about curbing perfectionism. Until then, this is Angela saying goodbye.
Goodbye. Childhood, which it was not always easy for you, I know.
No, I was one of those perfectionists that we're talking about. Okay, Naomi, how are you?
I'm doing well, but not perfectly. And I'm trying to be okay with that. No, I think many people have experienced some kind of perfectionism in their lives. And so this is just talking more about how to prevent that in your children. And I think it's some helpful guidelines for adults as well.
One of the things we've learned in this, well, I think it's common knowledge as we observe people, is that perfectionism can be caused either from an internal source for a person, as in my case, or from an external source, that is parents and teachers putting out those standards and expectations for a child.
Approval is one of those big things. We learned in the first day approval, and then we did expanded upon it in the second day yesterday. How children are seeking approval. That's their way they view of getting love and approval from their parents. The interesting thing about this is a behavior that carries on all through adulthood.
Yes.
And we see adults doing things, trying to be perfect because they're still looking for approval from their family and their parents. It will even go to the perverse extreme, one of our words from yesterday, perverse extreme of getting approval from parents that have already passed away.
Wow, how can you do that?
Well, it's a psychological thing where they still feel that pressure to get approval from their parents.
We talked yesterday about two big motivators being love and fear, and I think that really shows up in perfectionism, where people are either motivated by the fear of failure or by the desire for approval or love. And, parents really play into that in a big way, and so I think there's a lot of great things in today's lesson to learn about.
Yes, we talked about perfectionism exhibiting itself either as overachievers or underachievers. Now, I think we all recognize it in overachievers. That's the person who is able to play the violin at concert level and go to Carnegie Hall and that sort of thing. We might say that person is an overachiever, or maybe they're just reaching their full potential. You see, this has to be individually applied.
I think we all know people who are really intelligent or maybe very talented that we have met through our lives, but they don't seem to achieve anything. And we wonder, how come this man or woman isn't accomplishing anything? They're so bright. And
yes.
that might be part of it.
The underachiever
right.
part. We talked quite a bit about that yesterday because we were talking about the paradox of perfectionism. And where did that lead us?
Well, basically to procrastination. People just put things off. If they don't think they're going to be able to do it well, sometimes they just won't do it until the very last minute. The problem with that is it gives you an excuse for why your work might be less than great. Less than you could have done.
Right, and as you said, these two words, fear and love, these are really the basic of the basic motivators of human behavior. Everything springs from one or the other of those. We have to look at that, and in doing so, I mentioned that we must tell ourselves the truth, because the truth it's like shining light on that fear, and when you shine the light on it, it goes away because you've replaced it with truth.
We say the truth shall set you free.
Exactly. Well, we're beginning today with tips that we as adults can use to help children overcome perfectionism. So let's begin with today's first reading.
Curbing perfectionism. Harvey and Kuttner advise parents and teachers to try these tactics. Model graceful acceptance of your own shortcomings. Laugh at your own mistakes. Be gracious and forgiving of others' failures and shortcomings. Redefine the word mistake. Teach that mistakes are proof of learning instead of failure. Give your child permission to make mistakes and discuss the benefits of making mistakes, learning patience, new skills, and the development of useful experience.
Well, listeners, I know that you may be in a car listening to us, or you may be in your bed just drifting off to sleep, or you may actually be sitting by the side of the radio and listening intently with our magazine in your hand. At any rate, I hope you can look at the magazine. We're on page 12, and we have this list of very helpful tips for overcoming perfectionism. So we're going to review those right now and discuss them. You listen carefully. The first one is
Model graceful acceptance of your own shortcomings. Laugh at your own mistakes. And model is actually one of our vocabulary focus terms, Angela. That means to represent qualities by displaying them, or in another way, let me say, just be a good example.
Well, Bill, do you have any problem laughing at your own mistakes?
No, I actually laugh at my own mistakes very, very freely. I laugh at everything. And I make a lot of mistakes, so I'm laughing all day.
So you don't mind if I point out your mistakes, do you, Bill?
Well, I don't know. I can point out my mistakes. Don't be pointing. You can't be pointing out.
Okay. All right. Well, what is the second one, Naomi?
Be gracious and forgiving of others' failures and shortcomings. And this is really important. I mean, if you're going to be able to show your children that you're willing to forgive them, and they see that behavior not being worked out in other relationships that you have,
yes,
they're really not going to be able to trust you. And so if you can be forgiving of other people around you, your kids will see that, and they'll understand that if they make a mistake, it won't be the end of the world.
You know, I remember a phrase I learned in school when I was studying about education. More is caught than taught. More is caught than taught. You see?
More is caught than taught. That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that a neat little saying? You can remember it easily. And it just means more is caught, that is, you see it and you observe it, you catch it. That impacts a person more than what they are taught just from teachers. So the way we live our lives actually is a stronger effect than our words are.
That's interesting. I can think of an example of being 6 or 7 years old and being with friends and their family, and the mother was driving a car and actually bumped her car into the car next to her at a shopping mall and made a scratch. And she actually wrote a note and put it on the windshield of the car with the phone number and saying if there was any cost that she would pay for it. This was when I was 6 years old. I still remember this example.
Yes.
Instead of just running away, which would have been a horrible example, this woman gave this great example.
And it reminds me, inversely, you can think of a father smoking a cigarette and telling his son, don't you ever smoke. And then he's sitting there puffing away. Those words will be ineffective. Okay, the third one says redefine the word mistake. Now, how do we usually define mistake?
Mistake we define as failure. It says right there, teach that mistakes are proof of learning instead of failure. We think, oh, no, I made a mistake. I failed.
You know, as I was going over this, my daughter was sitting at the table with me, and I asked her, I said, what are some examples of mistakes that are proof of learning instead of failure? And she said, well, Thomas Edison and the light bulb. I said, oh, yeah, right. He says that he learned 5,000 ways not to make a light bulb before he made one that worked.
Right.
That's right. And, often mistakes feel like something that you've done wrong. Like you're a bad person if you make a mistake. And that's not, everyone makes mistakes. And we get a lot further from learning from them.
At least they're trying.
Right, exactly.
You know, they're making the effort. And that's what I tell my girls when they do less than perfect on an exam or in a performance. You know, at least you're there, you're involved and participating. Well, what's the next one, Bill?
Give your child permission to make mistakes and discuss the benefits of making mistakes.
That's something else when I read it, I asked my daughter. I said, what do you learn from making mistakes? And she said, well, I learned one way how not to do it.
There you go.
That's right. You eliminated another option that was not the right one.
Yes.
I made a note on this. This is permission to make mistakes. Kind of tied this in with sports because we talk about perfectionism in sports. A lot of people want to be perfect in sports. One example I think of is growing up, you had to learn how to lose. Everybody wants to win, whether it's on a team, playing baseball or basketball, or even just one-on-one, a board game. You have to learn how to lose. You can't win every game. And, so you lose. But there's actually a gift in learning how to lose gracefully.
You give yourself permission. That's right, to say, oh, it's okay that I lost. I tried my best. Well, one of the things we learn is patience, right?
For sure. And one of the contexts that I was thinking about as far as perfectionism and where it really gets bred is musical performance. When children take music lessons, I did. And it can be so difficult because it really does feel like the only option if you're performing a piece of music is to get it right.
Yes.
There cannot be mistakes. And, I think there's a lot of patience that can be learned from making a few of those mistakes, even in a performance, and just trying to remember that this is hard work, and you've come a long way, way to go.
Right. Well, I know our philosophy here, our teaching philosophy here at Studio Classroom is, just open your mouth and speak. Sure, you're going to make mistakes as you begin, but we all make mistakes. Even we native English speakers make mistakes.
Absolutely.
I mean, here in the studio, we'll catch one another. Bill will catch me on pronunciation of words.
You should see me trying to speak Chinese sometimes.
Oh, boy. Me
Tell
too.
the taxi driver, and he thinks I'm telling him I want a cheeseburger instead of where I'm going.
Yep.
Well, that's right. Everyone makes mistakes. And so we learn patience. We also learn humility. And we may learn new skills as we go along and develop useful experience. Well, these are some of the tips for curbing perfectionism. Let's go on and hear some more.
Help your child explore the degree to which perfectionism affects all aspects of life, including relationships, work, play, and appearance. Help your children identify comments they make to themselves that are critical, judgmental, and derogatory. Help them develop alternative, more positive internal messages. Directly address your child's fear that if they are not perfect, failure is ensured. Develop the concept that any grade other than an A is not an F. Encourage self-compassion.
We are looking at tips here in our Advanced Studio Classroom magazine. The psychology article is entitled The Perfect Child, and the tips tell us how to curb perfectionism. Well, listeners, I don't know if any of you are affected by perfectionism, but from my observation of people here in Asia, I think a lot of people are perfectionists. So we've talked about the negative effects of this and how we can help our children curb their tendency toward perfectionism. Well, Bill, we begin with a new set of tips. What's the first one?
This is interesting. To help your child explore the degree to which perfectionism affects all aspects of life, including relationships, work, play, and appearance. This is very mature. This is a very mature thinking, but it's something we can start with our children at an early age. And just so they can see how aspects of life, like relationships, things don't have to be perfect.
And they won't be perfect.
Yeah.
Now, that's just the realistic look at it. It will never be perfect. So to think that when you get married, you've got this wonderful romance and everything's going to be roses
Perfect.
and cotton candy, you're in for a big letdown.
Also, I think perfectionists are in relationships with other people, and they set the same standards for those people that they do for themselves, which are too high.
Yes.
And then sometimes the relationships never go anywhere. Sometimes they do, and it's just so stressful for everyone involved.
Well, you can think of team sports. If you have a perfectionist on your team, now he may put himself under a lot of pressure to make every shot and never drop the ball, but he may also be the one that's trying to put the pressure on everyone else.
Right. That person, we say, passes on their anxiety to everybody else on the team or in the room. And I like that last one, appearance, Angela, because I think you're experiencing dealing with some of that right now.
Well, not right now.
Not yourself, but dealing with your children.
Oh, with my children. I thought you were talking about
not
myself.
yourself.
No, I'm saying, Bill, I'm accepting
is fine.
I'm accepting my gray hairs, Bill. I'm not trying to cover them up anymore. But yes, my teenage daughter, she's at that age where her hair has to be perfectly straight and her makeup done exactly right. The belt that she wears has to be just the exact right angle when she puts it on. I mean, this is really a problem.
But even so, in this particular case, it's not that big a problem. I mean, clearly it's an issue, but there are much more serious issues that come out of this kind of perfectionism. Eating disorders can stem from perfectionism, and it's such a problem. I think, if there are any young people out there with eating disorders, just remember, you don't have to look perfect. And one person's idea of what's perfect is different from other people's. And, everyone looks good. Don't worry about it so much, When perfectionism rubs off on your appearance, it can be just so detrimental. It can really bring you down.
And, I have to think of it this way. Even if a person, or I'll say a teenage girl, is able to achieve this look of the fashion model, is she really perfect? No. She's still not a perfect person, even though she might have this beautiful appearance. So, putting that as your standard and then realizing that when you achieve this one level of it, you still haven't achieved the next level. So that girl's going to push herself on and on.
Right. And, I sort of just think nothing is ever as good as it looks in the movies, There's this perfectionism that is displayed in the media sometimes. We have to remember that this is real life. And, we just need to learn from those things that aren't perfect and accept them and work with them.
I have to say, Naomi, just as an aside to that, I often think about the virtual reality that we see on the computer and on the internet. And now that's even a step beyond television. I mean, at least with television, you're often working with real people, making them look beautiful and doing impossible things. But on the internet, they draw these beautiful people and doing impossibly fantastic things, and I wonder how that affects the thinking and, the self-image of our young people.
That's a great point, because so many young people do play these video games. It does have a big impact. I like that next one, Angela, and it helps your children identify comments they make to themselves that are critical, judgmental, and derogatory. Very important, because we are often the words that we use. How do we describe ourselves? We become the words that we use.
I've worked with a lot of young people, and I would hear, girls say, "Oh, I'm ugly," or "I'm stupid," and I would get really mad at them. Be like, "Don't ever let me hear you say that again. It's not true." And if you keep telling yourself that it's true, you're going to start to believe it.
Oh, yes, and I have to deal with my younger daughter on this. She's really the more effusive one that will just say things without thinking about it, and I have to remind her that what she said is not true about herself. Well, look, it takes you right back to this book I brought in, telling yourself the truth.
Right, and the truth is that we're we're created in such an amazing way, and each of us have such wonderful gifts to share, and we need to be able to focus more on that.
Right, and so if we are critical, judgmental, and derogatory, these are all negative things. Derogatory just simply means showing strong disapproval and not showing respect for yourself. So we want to help our children develop more positive internal talk. So, Bill, what's the next one?
Next one, directly address your child's fear that if they are not perfect, failure is ensured. Develop the concept that any grade other than an A is not an F. And very applicable here in Asia, because if my students do not get 100 on a quiz, they are just moaning at their desk and screaming, "Oh, no, 99!"
Oh, my. When actually C is the average.
Right.
So if you don't get an A, it's not an F. You can be average. You could even be a little below average in some ways, because as we will quickly see when we read this sidebar material, that everyone has gifts in different areas.
Right. My mom was great with this. She used to just say, "Okay, you got a C. My question is, did you try?"
Yes.
You know, like how much effort did you put into this? If you really tried, then that's fine.
That's right. Well, the final one says, encourage self-compassion. What does the word compassion mean?
It's interesting to be used in this context because it means a strong feeling of sympathy or sadness for the suffering of others and a desire to help them. Well, this is encouraging, feeling that way for yourself. When you're struggling with things, trying to help yourself along and be motivated and not just sort of give up on everything.
Now, how might self-compassion be different from self-pity?
Well, sometimes we say to somebody, don't be too hard on yourself. If you have failure, we beat ourselves up and we're very hard. Oh, I'm so bad. Oh, I'm such a failure. And whereas maybe that's self-pity might be is, oh, I'm pathetic. Oh,
poor me.
Nobody loves me. Oh, poor me, poor me.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a little bit different. Self-pity would be like being sad about yourself. And compassion needs you being really hard on yourself.
But compassion also, it's a matter of helping yourself along out of that. There's more action involved in compassion, trying to really help somebody.
Yes.
Instead of just saying, oh, this is really awful.
And actually, compassion can be a form of love. It's saying encourage self-love. Well, that doesn't mean to get stuck on yourself, but it means to think well of yourself, to expect the better of yourself.
I think these are great tips, too, Angela, for our children to practice for themselves, but also we would like to encourage your children to practice these with other children. Because often in the classroom I will see behavior where one child will say, "You're so stupid," or you know, something like, or "You're fat," or something like that to another student. I always correct it right then, and I tell them, you have to apologize, don't do it. It's important that if they can learn how to do that with others too.
Yes, a good point. Well, in fact, that leads us right into this other material that we're going to add as added value to today's lesson. It's there on page 12. We're going to read Encourage a Different Way of Thinking. So, can you read that for us, Naomi?
Sure. Perfectionism is a way of thinking that can be changed. Encourage a more realistic attitude toward life. So first of all, develop realistic rather than perfectionistic goals. Reward progress toward goals. Reward for trying a new activity, regardless of how well the child performs.
Okay, let's stop there and talk about these first three before we go any further. We're saying then that perfectionism is a way of thinking. Interesting. It is. It's your perception of reality and expectations.
Right, it's not necessarily accurate.
Right, and it can be changed. So once a person identifies the problem in their thinking, they need to have a more realistic attitude, a more realistic outlook. on life. So the first point follows right on it.
Right, to develop realistic rather than perfectionistic goals. You don't have to get 100 on every quiz.
You might need to have someone help you develop those realistic goals to begin with. And then, Naomi, in follow-up, we can
reward progress toward those goals.
The rewards come in different ways. Actually, the reward depends on the person. And we want to reward, then, the child for trying a new activity regardless of how well they perform, as you said. Just for trying.
Right.
Good. Okay, continue, please.
Well, encourage becoming comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity.
Okay, Bill, those two words, uncertainty and ambiguity, what are we talking about?
Well, uncertainty means we're not sure of something, and ambiguity means something is kind of a mystery, so information is kind of hidden. We don't know enough about it.
Right. And this is something I've been able to really make great strides on. Okay, the next one, Naomi.
Encourage the child to spend energy learning to care about and help others.
Well, Bill just addressed that, I think. So let's go on to the next one.
Discuss your own and the child's strengths and weaknesses, and emphasize that no one is superior in all areas.
Yes, that's a very good point. We read here, as this point is continued, psychologist Howard Gardner gives us 7 types of intelligences that we can use as a framework for, helping ourselves feel better about ourselves. People have different abilities. So, Bill, what is one of these?
Verbal.
That's just meaning in your ability to speak.
Speaking. Numerical, maybe good at math and numbers.
And what is spatial?
I always think of people who are really good at directions.
Yes, right.
Knowing where they are, reading maps, and just being aware of the surroundings and space instead of just
I would think that
words.
architects have to be good with spatial use. Then musical. I know that there are some people that just seem to be born with musical ability.
Well, they have musical ability or they might have athletic ability.
And then there's social ability, this ability to work with others. And finally, the ability to really understand yourself.
Right.
Well, listeners, we've come to the end of this article and the end of our time. So we have to say goodbye to you now. So this is Angela.
Naomi.
And Bill.
Saying goodbye.
Goodbye.